Hi, everybody. This is Mrs. Clemens, and I'm going to go over this PowerPoint with you and give you a little bit of information on World War II and the Holocaust, since this is part of our Unit 3 springboard. So this, what I'm showing you here is just some posters. I want you for the U.S. Army. And that was because World War II was going on, and it took place between 1933 and 1945. The picture to the right, where it says to remain silent and indifferent is the greatest sin of all. This is actually from Elie Wiesel. He's a Holocaust survivor. He wrote Night, which some of you may read. So let's talk about the Holocaust a little bit. So the Holocaust was a systematic, bureaucratic, and state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. So where does that word Holocaust come from? It comes from the Greek origin, which means sacrificed by fire or burnt whole, which will mean a little bit more as I get further into the conversation. So the leader of the Nazis was Hitler, okay? And he came to power in Germany in 1933. So his belief was that the Germans were racially superior and that the Jews were inferior to the German community. So besides Jews, he also targeted other groups, okay, such as the Gypsies, disabled people, some people of Slavic origin, such as Poles and Russians. He also persecuted people who had different political, ideological, and stood for their own beliefs, okay? These could be socialists, people such as Jehovah's Witness, or even people who were homosexual. So up at the picture at the top there, the right, you'll see picture of some women there. Targeted group, here's some more pictures of gypsies. Gypsies are a group of people that usually travel from place to place. One of the other big groups that were targeted were people with disabilities. Although Jews, whom the Nazis deemed a priority danger to Germany, were the primary victims of Nazi racism, other victims included 200,000 Roma gypsies and at least 200,000 mentally or physically disabled patients, mainly Germans, who were living in institutional settings, were murdered in what they called the euthanasia program. So what you see here on this target group location, you'll see it's called Hartham Castle. And this was a euthanasia killing center where people were sent with physical and mental disabilities. So they were killed by either being gassed or they were given a lethal injection. Off to the right, you'll see some buses. And these buses were used to transport patients to the euthanasia centers. And if you look at the windows real close, they are painted. And the reason that they're painted is because they wanted to prevent other people from seeing who was inside. Some more target groups. As Nazi tyranny spread across Europe, Germans and their collaborators persecuted and murdered millions of other people. Between 2 and 3 million Soviet prisoners of war were murdered or died of starvation, disease, neglect, or maltreatment. The Germans targeted the non-Jewish Polish intelligentsia for killing, but then deported millions of Polish and Soviet civilians for forced labor in Germany or in occupied Poland, where oftentimes these people died under horrible conditions. So this next page, there's a young girl to the left. Her name is Emmy, and she was a 16-year-old housemaid, and she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. So she was sent to a euthanasia center where she was killed by an overdose of tranquilizers. Okay. The lady in the center, she was the head nurse of the children's area, and she was in charge of the killing of a lot of these kids. Excuse me. Okay, so for the next group, target groups: homosexuals, political opponents, and religious dissidents. It says, from the earliest years of the Nazi regime, German authorities persecuted homosexuals and others whose behaviors did not match prescribed social norms. The German police also targeted thousands of political opponents, including communists, socialists, and trade unionists or labor unionists, and religious dissidents, such as people who were Jehovah's Witnesses. So pretty much what this is saying is that if you did not believe how Hitler wanted you to believe, or you did not live how Hitler thought you should live, you could be subject to persecution. So a lot of these people who went against Hitler died as a result of incarceration and maltreatment. So the next slide is just an example of some of their uniforms or pajamas. You'll see that they have, like, there's a patch on them. Some of them, those patches indicated whether they were Jewish, whether they were like a Pole, and they had numbers on them. And those numbers were the same numbers that were tattooed. And I will get to that in a little bit, because each person that was sent to a concentration camp was tattooed with a number. So they no longer had a name. So like mine is Mrs. Clemens, I would just be 54178, for example. Okay, so in the picture, there's some German soldiers there. So this is now the introduction of concentration camps. So in the early years of the Nazi regime, the National Socialist government established concentration camps to detain real and imagined political and ideological opponents. Increasingly, in the years before the outbreaks of war, the SS and police officials incarcerated Jews, Roma, and other victims of ethnic and racial hatred in these camps. So you can see there's some different pictures there of the German soldiers. And a lot of times before people were put into concentration camps, they had what was called ghettos. They had closed ghettos and they had open ghettos. Now, when you guys think of the term ghetto, as we've heard it used in slang terms today, it's not the same type of situation. So, for example, if we were here in Hobart, where we live, and we were in a closed ghetto. Okay, we would not be able to go to different places, such as, Portage or Maryville. We would have to stay here. And oftentimes, if you looked at the picture of the buildings, families would no longer have their own individual homes or their own individual things. They would be forced to live several people to a building, several families in a room. When people were picked up to be sent to ghettos and concentration camps, they were often told to get whatever you can carry. So they had to leave pretty much their lives behind, which was very, very hard for families. So here's an example of kind of what I'm talking about. On the picture on the left, it says bundles abandoned by Jewish deportees from the Krakow ghetto. So when I was talking about they were only able to take what they could carry, they would carry often times these bundles. And then there were times where German soldiers and that would round them up and they would have to leave their things there. And actually the German soldiers and that would then go through, and I'll show you that in pictures later on, they would go through their belongings. Off to the right is a picture of some orphan children within the Lotz ghetto. So these kids, their parents were picked up by German soldiers, taken away to concentration camps or death camps. Here is a crowded ghetto street. On the left here, they were extremely packed. You could see that on the picture at the top right, you could see some kids crying, and you can see down at the right is some German soldiers who have set some buildings on fire. A lot of times, store owners, business owners, when all of this started, their homes and their businesses and things would get looted or set on fire by the German soldiers as a way to force them out. So let's talk about some concentration camps. So the Nazis established killing centers for mass murder, okay? Unlike concentration camps, which served as detention and labor centers, killing centers were referred to as extermination camps or death camps. So you went there, you went there to die, okay, basically. The German SS and the police murdered nearly 2,700,000 Jews in killing centers, and they did this by asphyxiation with poison gas, or they would shoot them. So what you're looking at there in that building is a crematorium where the bodies, sorry, I hit the screen, where the bodies would be sent once they had died, and that tall smokestack, that's where the smoke would come up from the bodies that were being burned. And from what I have read, you can smell and you could see smokestacks for miles. Okay, so when the victims, our men, women, and children, were sent to these concentration camps and killing centers, anything that they had, they couldn't take with them. And so what the German soldiers would do, they would collect their things. They would collect their wedding rings. They would collect hairbrushes, like in this picture. They would collect their shoes. They would collect their luggage. Anything that they had was no longer theirs. It was property of the Nazis, okay? The first killing center was Chelmno, Okay, and that opened, and it was part of Poland, and that opened up in 1941. Mostly Jews, but then there were some gypsies also. They were gassed in mobile vans. So they set up vans that they were able to put these men and women in and kill them through that. In 1942, Nazis opened Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka killing centers. Okay. And these were known primarily for the murder of the Jews of Poland. Those three that I just mentioned, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, if you read a lot about Holocaust and the history, those are ones that tend to pop up a lot. Okay, so almost all of the deportees who arrived at camps were immediately sent to death in gas chambers, with the exception of small numbers who were chosen for special work teams. Now, I had the honor of meeting a Holocaust survivor. Her name is, or was, she just passed away last year, Eva Kors. And she actually was here at Auschwitz. So I'm going to explain to you what she told me as I sat in and listened to her experience of being part of the Holocaust. Okay, so the picture that you're looking at is a killing center called Auschwitz, and you guys might have heard of that. So by 1943, they had 4 gas chambers working here at this facility. Okay. There were about 6,000 Jews that were gassed each day here. And over 1 million Jews and 10,000s of Roma, Poles, and Soviet prisoners of war were killed there by 1944. So what I was told was, as you pulled up in the boxcars, which I'm going to show you, you got off on one side or the other of the tracks, okay? If they say had you get off the train and went to the left side, you were going to be put on a special work team, okay? You had a chance of survival. But if you were one that perhaps looked older or sickly, they would have you get off the train and go to the right. And where, if you got off to the right, you had no chance of survival, they would march you directly, to the gas chambers. So here are some examples of the boxcars. When we think of trains, we think of the South Shore, or even the trains that you guys see going through Hobart here all the time. But these boxcars were awful situations. The men, women, and children who were put on these boxcars, you could see there's very little windows. So, and there's no seats. So they were forced to stand, oftentimes for hours or sometimes even days, depending on how far the travel was. And it was a dark situation in there, okay, because they didn't have the light and electricity that we do now, like if we were riding a train. And so these men, women, and children were often forced to have to use the bathroom on the train where they were at. It was awful conditions for these men, women, and children on these trains. A lot of times, the weakest or the sickest did not even make the train ride, as you can see in the pictures there. Oftentimes, families were separated. The wives and kids would go to one camp, and the husbands, even the sons, would go to another camp. Here is an example of a boxcar, and you can see that there's a little window there, and you can also see the barbed wire to try to prevent them from escaping. They were actually locked in there. I actually went to a Holocaust museum. I've been to a couple, and they actually had a train car there. And I was able to stand inside it, and it was a very eerie feeling, knowing what these people went through. Okay, so here, what I'm looking at on this next slide is the entrance to Auschwitz. You can see the sign, and you can see some men there, and often to the right is their housing. They were bunks. They did not have beds. They had platforms where you had to just pretty much find a spot to sleep. You often were not given, blankets or pillows, anything like that we're used to living with. Pretty much what they had on their backs was what they had. And they were crammed in those little spaces. Okay. They didn't have bathrooms or showers like we have now. They had holes in the ground, and that was where they had to go to the bathroom. So when I was telling you guys about the pictures of Eva Core was telling us how you got off, for example, to the left, you had a chance of living because you were going to a special workforce. To the right, you were being marched. This is an example of that. You can see that the groups of people are separated. Sorry, this is a little gruesome, but it is reality. You'll see some pictures of glasses, some pictures of shoes, and some pictures of men from the Holocaust. Here are some more. The men, women, and children were pretty much almost being starved. They were forced to work hours upon hours, doing any sort of labor that they were required to do, with given very little food or water to survive. Okay, so here are some examples of the gas chambers. So once a person died, you can see up at the top, that's where they would put the bodies. If they were doing gassing, they would have the people take off their clothes because they would often reuse their clothing for other people that were coming into the concentration camps. So this is where they would go to die. And if you look at the right under the sign that says gas chambers, those are scratch marks from people trying to get out. Okay. Oftentimes they would put in this poisonous gas, these pellets, and then once they came in, they hit the ground, they exploded, it kind of asphyxiated or choked them. Okay, so the SS considered the killing centers top secret. To obliterate all traces of gassing operations, the special prisoner units were forced to remove corpses from the gas chambers and cremate them. So that's why I showed you guys the crematorium with that small smokestacks. And the grounds of some killing centers were landscaped or camouflaged to disguise the murder of millions. So what they did was called propaganda. So they would make it seem all beautiful and decorated on the outside of this concentration camp to try to fool people, okay? Oftentimes they would, do commercials, or they would do like newscasts and make these concentration camps appear better than what they were, to fool the public, okay? On the right is a tattoo, okay? And when you went into a concentration camp, you had a number and a letter. So when you entered the camp, if you were male or female, who you were with, if you were sick or healthy, the actual concentration camp name, and you were marked. And the numbers were like in the 20,000. So you could see it says 15970. So that would be like 15,970. And the A could actually stand for Auschwitz, that you were there at that particular concentration camp. So this is just some artwork that has been created at different Holocaust museums around the world. Here are some more. Toward the end of the Holocaust, the SS guards moved camp inmates by train or forced marches. So they would do what was called death marches. And they did this because the Allies were coming and they tried to move these large number of prisoners. So they would move them from place to place. And along the way, because of a lot of health issues, a lot of these men and women who were forced to march did not even make it from one camp to another. A lot of them died en route, and if they couldn't make it, they would be shot. The marches, they continued until May 7th of 1945, when the German armed forces finally surrendered to the Allies, okay? World War II officially ended on May 8th, while Soviet forces announced theirs on May 9th, 1945. Right here is a map of the different death march routes and evacuations that they did. The ghettos are marked with little stars. Okay, the concentration camps are marked with little squares. And then the square with the dot in it, you can see that a little bit closer. That would be an extermination camp. So what happened after the Holocaust? Well, a lot of times people would think, oh, people just got to go back to their normal lives. That was not the case. In fact, when Allied soldiers arrived at some of these concentration camps, their first instinct was to rush to them and give them food, give them water. And they were told that they couldn't do that. And the reason is that these men, women, and children were so malnourished and so sick at this point, if they gave them anything without being evaluated, it could do more harm to them than good, okay? So what did they do with all of these men, women, and children to help them? They had displaced person camps. So between 1948 and 1951, almost 700,000 Jews immigrated to Israel, including 136,000 Jewish displaced persons. So as they got better was when they were able to leave these camps and try to get on with a somewhat normal life. Other people immigrated to the United States and other nations, and then it wasn't until 1957 when the last displaced persons camp was closed. So if you think about it, the war ended in 1945, and this is 1957. So it took 12 years to nurse some of these people back to health, get them on their feet so that they could actually live a somewhat normal life. So these are pictures of, on the left, a wagon is piled high with bodies of former prisoners in Buchenwald concentration camp. And to the right are more bodies of men, women, and children who passed during this time. This right here on the left is actually one of like the famous pictures that I've seen, because this guy, he's a Russian internee. He was at Buchenwald, and he confronts like one of the soldiers, one of the people that had been tormenting him after he was arrested and he was freed. And then on the right is the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. So these are some of the survivors, and they're pointing to themselves. The lady to the right that has the blue and green on, that's Eva Kors. That's the lady that I was able to meet and talk with. She is one of the twins, her and her sister, Miriam. And one of the things that happened during the Holocaust was you had this doctor, Joseph Mengele, and he did experiments on twins. So Eva Kor had a family. You know, she had a mom, dad, she had some siblings. They all passed away during the Holocaust. But Eva and her sister Miriam survived. And that was because of the fact that they were twins. Dr. Mengele used these twins to do experiments on them. So, for example, Miriam, she was given all kinds of, medicine and experimental stuff. Her kidneys actually stopped growing when she was about 10. So she had continuous kidney issues throughout her life. Her sister Eva, she was given different drugs. And Dr. Mengele, he wanted to see the side effects, what would happen with these twins. So he would do all kinds of like scientific experiments on these twins, not just them, but many sets of them. So they were, if you think about it, they were like guinea pigs. Like when scientists use rats and mice and things to test out medication, Dr. Mengele was actually doing it on people. Eva and Miriam survived. They both had the will to live, so they weren't going to let anything get in their way. They both had some health issues afterwards. Miriam had more health issues than Eva. She died, I believe it was in 1993, and Eva Kor actually passed away on July 4th of 2019, so it was recent. They opened the Candles Holocaust Museum. That's why you'll see a little icon there in the center in Terre Haute, Indiana. And that's where I actually got to learn more about the Holocaust and got to meet her in person. So here's something that I want to read to you. First, they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. And this actually came from a Holocaust survivor. So I hope you learned a little bit about the Holocaust between ReadWorks and my explanation on the PowerPoint. And I will be on Zoom to answer any more questions that you may have.